we won't talk about pharmaceutical companies today. We'll talk about other companies. And I will cut it short because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions and answers. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Gorick. I'm now a little bit concerned this is going to be really boring after that, so please bear with me, and thanks very much everybody for coming out on a rainy night like tonight, or at least staying indoors and not going out into the rain anyway. The lecture this evening is going to be about a research agenda that began at the school focusing on tobacco control and the role of tobacco corporations in influencing and shaping policy debates on tobacco control, and developed into a programme of work that we've done about the alcohol industry. Now, one of the things that's intrigued me since I've worked on this topic is the very different approaches which are taken to alcohol policy and tobacco control policy. And within that, the very different attitudes that governments and decision makers at the national level and also at the supranational level, at the global level, have towards the corporations in those areas. I'm going to argue that there are radically different approaches taken in these areas, and that it's very difficult actually to find a legitimate ground to justify why such a different approach is taken in terms of the types of regulation that we consider possible or even normal or mainstream in terms of tobacco, but are still seen as highly controversial or draconian or overly interventionist when applied to alcohol. And I'm going to argue also that the position adopted towards the industries, which is something which is broadly a partnership-based approach taken to the alcohol industry in many contexts, or to see the alcohol industry as a social partner or as part of the NGO sector almost in terms of some UN meetings, it is radically different from the approach taken to the tobacco industry, which is broadly excluded from these types of policy debates. Okay. So I'm going to start off in the first part of the lecture by sort of going over the history of sort of tobacco control and tobacco control policy, and I'll go on to say something about work that we've done on alcohol after that. And then we'll bring it back together to try to draw some comparisons or try to understand the rationale for these different approaches towards the end of the lecture. Does anybody recognise this slightly nondescript looking grey building here? Does anybody have an idea what that is? I may have seen it. There's certainly no sign on the outside of this building that might indicate what it is. This is a British American tobacco or BAT repository that was based in the glamorous location of Guildford in Surrey and housed millions of pages of internal tobacco industry documents. Now, this documentation was released into the public domain as a result of litigation that occurred in the United States in the 1990s. So there were some leaks which occurred before this, some sort of papers that were sort of leaked to colleagues of ours at the University of San Francisco before this. But the overwhelming majority of the documentation came after the health service providers in the United States sued the tobacco industry to try and recoup the costs of treating people who'd died from or suffered serious health consequences from tobacco. Now, the consequence of this is that all of a sudden we had an unprecedented and invaluable data source on which to study the activities of the tobacco industry. And we could do really interesting comparative work comparing what the tobacco industry would say publicly, for example, what they would say about the addictiveness of nicotine or the harmfulness of cigarettes publicly, and what they would say to policymakers, what they would say in terms of the scientific research they funded and produced, and what they were actually saying internally and what they knew. And there's evidence that decades before tobacco companies admitted the addictive nature of their products or the harmful nature of their products, they knew that those products were harmful. You know, there's a key quote. There's a film called The Insider with Al Pacino that documents some of these goings on. And there's a key line in there where it says, we're in the nicotine delivery business, right? So they knew they were developing an addictive product, and they would undertake research to make products as addictive as possible. So we've got this unprecedented look inside the black box, the internal workings of a company. And this is why there's now a vast literature on tobacco control and dedicated journals such as the Journal of Tobacco Control, which look specifically at industry tactics. So we know a great deal about what the tobacco industry did. However, these documents are largely historical in nature now, so they date up to more or less the beginning of the century, around the year sort of 2000 and shortly afterwards. And as new litigation is undertaken, certain amounts of new documents are released, but largely these documents now represent a historical artifact. Now, a lot of these documents have been scanned and put online, and we have searchable databases, but most of the activities of the industry that we're looking at now are things which happened at the time of or prior to the litigation that took place previously. So we've now had to develop new methodologies for studying the tobacco industry. We've had to find new data sources. We've had to use things that are in the public domain, or try to generate new material in order to study the tobacco industry. For example, using interviews with people who've been involved in policy debates, or people who've worked in government, or people who were formerly in the industry even. Let's move on from that. Okay. Just to give an example of one of the things that came out of the tobacco documents research, this is this would have been a memo. This is like a kind of 1980s version of an email, right? So this would be an internal communication written on a piece of paper and sent physically around an organisation, and it's from Martin Broughton, who at one time was the chief executive of British American Tobacco, another time was the chairman of the company, and he's communicating with the BAT executive in Kenya, and they're talking about attempts to shape the tobacco control laws in Kenya. And the key kind of line is is underlined in red here. It says the law was actually drafted by us, so drafted by British American Tobacco, but the government is to be congratulated on its wise actions. Okay. So this is a very clear example of the level of access that the tobacco industry had to key policymakers and decision makers, right? It's evidence also of the usefulness of companies to governments, right? So particularly governments with limited resources. So governments in Kenya, for example, they may have very limited capacity within the health ministry to work on tobacco control issues. We know for sort of anecdotal evidence from colleagues working there, they may have one person who works half a day a week on tobacco control issues. So if a company with significant resources above and beyond that, with access to constitutional lawyers, with access to health experts who are able to draft laws for the government, that's a very attractive proposition. So the company can say, okay, you need to put legislation in place in order to have a tobacco control policy. Let us help you with that. We'll draft that for you. And it's very difficult for governments. I mean, even in the sort of context of the UK or other European countries, under austerity since 2008, 2010, increasingly shrinking resources, increasingly greater demands for government action in different areas, it's very difficult for policymakers to be able to turn that down. So it gives you an indication of the type of access that tobacco companies are able to get and the type of influence that they're able to wield simply because of the economic and human capital resources they have available to them. A key aspect of tobacco industry strategy is around advertising, okay? And the cigarette market is dependent largely on branding, okay? So if you do blind taste testing with smokers, right? So if you offer smokers different cigarettes stripped of the kind of livery and packaging, and you ask them to differentiate between those cigarettes when they smoke them, it's very low levels of smokers are actually able to identify the brands that they smoke, right? And really, if we go back to kind of the self-confessed rationale for the tobacco companies, if they're really in the nicotine delivery business, as long as a cigarette does that job, as long as it delivers nicotine, if someone's smoking on the basis of an addiction to nicotine, a physical craving to nicotine, the primary purpose of that cigarette is to alleviate that craving, right? So actually, how do you differentiate between products which are highly fungible? This is a term that's kind of used in sort of marketing, that these products are easily substituted for one another. You can smoke a Marlboro, you can smoke Benson and Hedges. They essentially do the same job. The way that cigarettes are differentiated from each other is through branding and brand identity. And I think it'd be very easy for all of us in the audience, even sort of the younger people amongst you who've probably not been exposed to anywhere near the kind of levels of cigarette marketing and advertising that I was when I was a child, for example. It'd be very easy for you to think of kind of brands associated with cigarettes. The Marlboro Man is the kind of classic thing, Joe Camel and Camel cigarettes, these sorts of things. So they're very powerful brands. They're very sophisticated branding organisations. They're able to create brands that have high degrees of loyalty through their consumers. And the strategy is that if you can attract smokers at an early age and develop a loyalty to a specific brand, those people will stay with you for life. They'll smoke your cigarette brand for life. Branding and marketing is also key in terms of recruiting other demographics, right? So it's not just about recruiting youth smokers. It's about creating new markets, right? So, for example, women traditionally, and in most markets around the world, smoke cigarettes at radically lower rates than men, particularly in certain societies. So branding and marketing of cigarettes is key to presenting the idea of smoking as something which is socially acceptable for women to do, or socially acceptable for particular demographics to do. Cultures where smoking may be alien, new markets, introducing brands such as Marlboro into lower middle income country contexts, for example. And this is a key component of the industry strategy. Markets outside the US or outside of Western Europe, where these companies are often based, is absolutely crucial to their strategy, because in countries like the UK, in countries like the US, regulation is increasing. It's much harder to market cigarettes. It's much harder to brand cigarettes. It's harder to compete on the basis of price because of high levels of taxation. And also the markets in these countries, at the very least, have reached saturation, and smoking levels are tending to tail off drastically as a result of tobacco control policies. In lower middle income settings, you have large populous countries, right? So you've got a lot of people, a lot of potential smokers. Very often these people will be increasingly affluent, or there will be a section of the population which is increasingly affluent and are amenable to marketing Western brands to them. Okay, so these are people who have disposable income for non-essential purchases like cigarettes, and people who identify with or want to associate with brands such as Marlboro, such as Western cigarette brands. And in addition to that, because of the difficulties I described earlier, or because of the lack of resources very often in ministries of health, the regulatory environment in which these companies are operating is often far more permissive than it would be somewhere like the UK. So you can brand cigarettes, you can market cigarettes. The cost of advertising in magazines, the cost of advertising on television when that's possible, it is much lower also. So it's a fantastic opportunity for tobacco companies to expand into new populous markets and reach new markets of smokers. This is an example of some of the advertising that was used in terms of sort of cigarettes, and this is a magazine advert from the late 1980s in the US. And I don't know if you can read. Can you read the text? It's probably not very clear. It says, "Never let the goody two shoes get you down." Right. And this is Virginia Slims. It's a brand of cigarettes which is marketed explicitly at women. Does anything strike you from this advert, or has anybody got any kind of reflections on how this advert might be appealing or effective, or what it's attempting to do? Anyone? Please, come on. I'm not going to ask you to marry me if you speak. Right, so, yeah.
It was an era where feminism was the main issue, maybe, and so by associating this to allow the women to have their voice heard, like pushing them.
Yeah.
I don't know, just a thought.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. There's clearly a kind of a gender component to this advert, right? So it's about targeting. Yeah.
Black women.
Yeah, absolutely right as well. Yeah. So there's two levels, I think, at which this advert works. So it's about kind of gender emancipation, but it's also associated with civil rights and the racial politics of the context in which the advert was evident. There's also this idea about the kind of don't let the goody two shoes get you down. This idea that smoking is somehow subversive, right? Somehow dangerous, somehow glamorous as well, right? And none of this is by accident. The very kind of origins of the public relations industry in the United States go back to a guy called Edmund Bernays. And he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he used Freud's ideas in developing political communications and marketing. And in 1924, he took out a series of adverts in newspapers in the US around. I think it was the New Year's Day parade in New York. There was a big parade through the city of New York, and he hired a float on there and dressed women up as suffragettes, right? So this would have been around the sort of same historical period of the kind of women's vote, or the women's right to vote movement in the UK. And in these adverts in the newspapers, he drew attention to this float and he said suffragettes would be on there lighting up torches of freedom. That's right. So this was the way in which cigarettes were branded as an integral component of, or an integral sign of, female emancipation at the very start. So there's another example here, again from Virginia Slims, and you can see the comparison of this. This is almost like a sort of archetypal image of sort of 1980s sort of yuppiedom, or self-actualization and economic success, wealth, and then you can see the kind of image up in the top corner of a generation ago, the woman sort of confined to the back room, not out in public, not free in a way that the woman smoking Virginia Slims would be. And it wasn't just about targeting women, it was also about targeting what we found in the tobacco documents referred to as future smokers, right? So young people. And this is an advert which is clearly targeted at kind of sort of young adolescent or even sort of pre-adolescent boys. And, this is sort of Joe, he's a cool guy, he's got the guns, he's got the car. This is what you can aspire to be if you smoke Camel Lights. It's easy to think that these kind of adverts are a slightly kind of quirky relic of the past, or kind of belong to a different era. But this is an advertising campaign from Germany in 2014, or it began in 2014, is ongoing since then. In Germany, it's still possible to do magazine advertising, right? So a lot of advertising in the European Union is actually banned at EU level because of the European Union Tobacco Products Directive. Germany, ironically, given it's got very, very high standards of public health in other areas, is very, very lax in tobacco control. It's one that it scores, along with Austria, scores as one of the worst complying member states of the European Union in terms of tobacco control policy. So you can still smoke in bars under certain circumstances in Germany, and you can still do display advertising like this. So this is an advertising campaign called "Don't be a maybe, be a Marlboro," and again, it's this idea that cigarette smoking is associated with self-actualization. It's associated with risk-taking, but risk-taking which is ultimately associated with reward. All right, so maybe we'll never be our own boss. Right, it's this idea that if you don't take risks, you won't get the reward, you won't get the payoff. But there's very little about the kind of downside. Right, so this lady here is I really hate looking at this image because I don't like heights very much, right? But she's sort of walking on the edge of a building. There's no sort of sense there of the impending danger, but there's something about the kind of excitement of being on the edge, all right? So this is an ongoing issue, and essentially the sort of the strategies and approaches to marketing cigarettes that were developed before often continue now. Cigarettes also, were associated with dangerous sports and activities. We were talking just before the start of the lecture about Marlboro's association with Formula One racing, for example. Now, there was a reason why Marlboro would, sponsor Formula One racing and not the kind of World Chess Championships or something like that, right? So it's partly because of the global exposure of the sport, but also about this idea of kind of danger and risk-taking. And, there are all these sorts of risky activities that you can take place in life, including smoking. But if you don't do it, is it really a life lived? Electronic cigarettes. Now, this has been a topic of extremely tense and vehement debate within the public health community, not least in this country in the last few years. Now, the issue of e-cigarettes is that many e-cigarette brands are now owned by and controlled by transnational tobacco corporations. So there's different types of e-cigarette, but most of these ones are called cigalikes because they look like cigarettes. And there's other types, and you often see these kind of bigger, sort of more industrial sort of strength e-cigarettes on the street with these kind of massive plumes of smoke coming from people. But the branded products, the cigalikes, are the ones that tend to be owned by the transnational tobacco corporations, and that's not by accident. I think it's because they resemble cigarettes. Very often, the packaging that they come in, or the kind of livery, the typefaces they use, are reminiscent of cigarette packaging and cigarette branding. Now, it could be argued, and I'll sort of be upfront on this, I come from the point of view on this where I'm highly cynical about the public health benefits of e-cigarettes. Well, not necessarily the public health benefits of e-cigarettes, but I'm highly cynical about the motivation for tobacco companies investing in e-cigarettes, all right? And I think that it's designed essentially to support their primary products, right, and their primary business model, which is to continue to sell and aggressively market tobacco brands around the world. And the e-cigarettes are designed to do certain things from it. It's to circumvent regulation of those products and to create a disincentive for current smokers to quit using nicotine, right? So to keep people addicted to nicotine and to keep people smoking at reduced levels rather than quitting for good and for all, and also potentially to create a gateway into smoking through products which may appear to be less harmful and therefore may be more attractive to health conscious people, to young people. Often these products are flavoured in a certain way and therefore may create a gateway into smoking. To give an example, the way that cigarettes, this is an old cigarette advert from Italy from the 1960s, I think from the 1950s actually. And on the other side is an advert for VIP, which is a brand of e-cigarettes which is targeted at women. Now, you can see how the availability of images like this in places in which tobacco advertising is banned could have, at very least, the unintentional side effect of subconsciously promoting smoking amongst people. Now, a cynic might argue that that's deliberately the case, and we don't know. We don't have the data to know that. But you can at least see how this could play an ancillary role in supporting, tobacco branding and marketing. We were talking before the lecture about the ban on behind-counter displays of cigarettes. So in the supermarket or in the corner shop, when you go in to buy cigarettes, often they used to be arranged in these kind of large sort of shelving units just behind the till, and all the brands would be sort of available there and clustered together to create a kind of noticeable sort of tapestry of colours associated with certain brands. And colour branding is very important to cigarette companies. So when they were no longer allowed to call Marlboro Lights, they started to call them Marlboro Golds. And so colour branding is very, very important to cigarettes. So at precisely the moment that these behind-counter displays were banned, you started to get displays. This is from my local petrol garage. I took that picture. You started to get these displays popping up on the counter right next to the checkout. So it's a way of circumventing regulation. Trade liberalisation is also very important in the context of tobacco control, and I won't go into kind of enormous amounts of depth about this because we don't have time. But the first thing to say is that trade liberalisation was very, very important in facilitating the expansion of tobacco companies into low and middle income countries. So WTO agreements, bilateral investment treaties between states create a mechanism through which largely American or European-based companies can enter markets in countries that previously may have had a national tobacco monopoly, for example. More recently, trade and investment agreements, WTO law, bilateral investment treaties have created a mechanism through which tobacco companies can challenge tobacco control policies at the national level. Okay, so in bilateral investment treaties, or BITs, these often contain something called an investor-to-state dispute resolution mechanism or dispute settlement mechanism. And what that means is a company which is an investor in one of the parties, one of the states which is party to the agreement, if it feels its investments are being unfairly treated or undermined by one of the parties to that agreement, it can sue them directly in an investment dispute resolution tribunal. Now, this is designed to mean that national governments don't discriminate in favour of their own companies against companies from other states who are party to these agreements. But it's been used particularly in the context of Australia and Australia's attempt to introduce standardised packaging for cigarettes as a means of sort of stymieing the development of that policy. So standardised packaging, we have it here now. This is basically what the pack looks like. It removes all of the colour branding, the livery, this really important component of cigarette marketing, particularly in environments where you can't do television advertising, you can't do magazine advertising. The pack was really the kind of last bastion, the last mechanism through which tobacco companies could brand their products, and standardised packaging or plain packaging removes that from them. So they fought vehemently to oppose that, to delay that, and to overturn it, and they challenged the legality of it in terms of their intellectual property rights, the rights they have to their logos and brands, and they challenged it under the Australian Constitution, under the Australia-Hong Kong Bilateral Investment Treaty, under the WTO agreement, principally the TRIPS agreement, the intellectual property component of the WTO agreements, and they lost all of those cases. But on the way, it created an enormous amount of cost and additional work for the Australian government to defend those cases. And arguably, the effect of, or one of the rationales for the tobacco industry, Philip Morris in particular, so aggressively defending its rights in Australia wasn't necessarily because of the cigarettes it was going to sell in Australia. Australia's a relatively small market. It's got one of the lowest levels of smoking rates in the world. Its population relatively large but insignificant compared to countries like China or India, for example, or even the US. What it was about is creating a disincentive for other countries to follow suit, right? Especially countries with limited resources, limited time and financial resources available to, to oppose that. So this is often referred to as the chilling effect. Yeah. I'm just going to say something very briefly about the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, because this creates the kind of global context in which policy debates about tobacco occur. And it's the first time that the WHO has used its kind of treaty-making powers to come up with a global sort of treaty in the area of public health. And as the name suggests, it's a broad framework for policy approaches and policy measures, which is designed then to be kind of filled in with protocols subsequently. And the first protocol is about kind of illegal, illicit trade in cigarettes. But what it does, it sets out the kind of best practice for governments to follow, the evidence base on the policies and what governments should do if they want to mitigate the effects of smoking. And it includes, crucially, is Article 5.3, right, which has the objective of limiting the influence of the tobacco industry influence over policy. All right, so it says that government should only meet with the tobacco industry in highly circumscribed circumstances, right? Only in public. There should be clear, and transparent reporting mechanisms, and it's designed explicitly to sort of limit the ability of tobacco industry to shape policy. Now, we don't have anything like that on alcohol. So there's various differences with alcohol, right? So firstly, the absence of a kind of global framework or a global kind of policy context on alcohol is highly evident. There isn't a framework convention on alcohol. There's hardly likely to be one at any point soon. The other problem we have with alcohol, trying to study alcohol corporations, is we don't have access to internal documents. So we are left dealing with data sources which are in the public domain, or trying to generate data through things like interviews. And there's inherent difficulties and problems with that type of research. So we are at a great disadvantage, and in part I think the availability of data and the difficulties methodologically with studying alcohol account for the massive disparity in the size of the literature that exists on tobacco versus alcohol. But I would say we're dealing actually with something more than that. It isn't just the fact that we don't have data, we don't have the means to study alcohol. I would argue that certainly in countries like the UK, and I know this differs sort of radically in different parts of the world, where for religious and cultural reasons alcohol is a very different position in society. But I would say in kind of the European context or the North American context, alcohol is viewed very differently as a policy object. It's viewed very differently as a social phenomenon. And as a result of that, the industry that produces it is also viewed very differently. Okay. I'm going to move through some of this stuff on the alcohol industry quite quickly. This is all derived from a study that we did of UK alcohol policy up to around 2010, and then some subsequent follow-up stuff we've done on it since then. There's also now an emerging literature from people like Tom Baber and David Jernigan looking at alcohol policy in Africa and looking at alcohol policy in India as well, which I would highly recommend people who are interested in this sort of follow up on. But the alcohol industry is harder to define. So when we talk about the tobacco industry, we're talking about producers, companies which produce and brand cigarettes. In the alcohol industry, it's a little bit more complicated because we also have the retailers play a really, really important role. So the retailers could be the pubs or nightclubs or bars where people consume alcohol, but it's also the supermarkets which sell alcohol often at highly discounted prices as part of their means of attracting people into their stores. So often the most expensive individual item in your trolley when you do your shopping, it might be a piece of meat, some beef or something like that, but it's highly likely it'll be a bottle of wine or a bottle of whiskey or a bottle of vodka or gin or something like that. So the single most expensive item that people are often buying at a supermarket is alcohol. Therefore, if you can discount that, it's a strong way of drawing people into your establishment. So we've got different interests and different objectives, different policy focuses from different parts of the industry. And as the quote at the bottom says, it's a highly fragmented industry. No one likes each other very much. We all hate each other. And even within sectors, even within the beer sector, we found evidence of kind of different positions, depending on the way in which companies sought to brand and position their products. The one thing I would say, though, is that, and this is a clear similarity with the tobacco industry, that it's a global industry. That the market in the UK, as elsewhere, is dominated by a very small number of transnational corporations. So even brands which kind of trade on their heritage as being part of the UK whisky brands, for example, very closely associated with kind of Scotland and Scottish culture and these sorts of things, they're often owned by large multinational corporations and are marketed in different ways around the world. So it's a highly concentrated industry, a global industry which is active in different markets across the world. Alcohol industry actors seek to sort of frame policy debates, right? They seek to speak directly to consumers, to voters, to put pressure on governments by framing policy debates in ways which are amenable to their interests. And what this means is trying to define the nature of problems, alcohol problems facing society, in ways that would lead governments to pursue policy interventions or forms of regulation that favour their interests. And the fundamental divide is between what are referred to as whole population measures, right? So something like banning advertising, increasing price, restricting availability, that would affect everybody regardless of the levels they drink at. And to try and shift the conception of the alcohol problem, to try and shift the policy debate towards targeted interventions which look to focus on particular subpopulations. So, for example, measures designed to target drink driving, measures designed to discourage women from drinking during pregnancy, measures designed to target the most harmful and hazardous drinkers, so what would often in sort of everyday parlance be called sort of alcoholics. Yeah. The industry also is able to act collectively, so setting aside the kind of divisions within the industry on areas of common concern, where the interests of the industry overall seem to be affected by government policy. They're able to collaborate and come together and work really effectively through trade associations and also these things called SAOs, or social aspects organisations. This is something like the Portman Group in the UK, and it's something slightly different to a trade association in that it doesn't obviously and overtly position itself as somebody or as an entity talking on behalf of the alcohol industry, but it sort of positions itself somewhere in between the industry and government as a body which talks about the social aspects of industry, but it has the effect of promoting an industry favourable regulatory agenda. There's also one of the things we saw in Scotland, for example, is there were divisions around minimum unit pricing of alcohol. So there were parts of the industry which were open to the possibility of minimum pricing being introduced. There were other parts, principally the spirits industry, because spirits tend to be bought through supermarkets at discounted prices and consumed at home, which were vehemently opposed to minimum pricing. And what we saw within the industry is the anti-minimum pricing message promoted by the spirits industry, emerging as the industry position. So there wasn't necessarily a coordination between all components of the alcohol industry, but certain parts of the industry which may have been mildly favourable towards minimum pricing or prepared to accept minimum pricing, stepping aside or being pushed to the side by the spirits industry or by the really vociferous opponents to minimum pricing. So there's this interesting dynamic within the industry of whose interests come to the fore, whose interests get articulated to government, and whose interests come to represent the industry position. Industry lobbying was ubiquitous. It was at all stages of the policy process, and it was targeted at all relevant policy actors: ministers, special advisors, members of the Scottish Parliament, members of Parliament, civil servants. The resources available to the industry mean that they're able to be present everywhere at all stages. And this quote, sort of, I think, underlines just how normal it is. It's just a completely normalised, accepted part of the policy process. They'll meet with the Public Health Minister 3 or 4 times a year. If we've got a really crucial topic, we might organise a special lunch or have additional meetings on top of that. But this idea that both from the kind of policymakers' perspective and the industry perspective, it was a completely normal and common sense part of the policy process that they should be involved in a way that simply wouldn't be possible if we were talking about the tobacco industry, for example. Let's move over that. The other key aspect of the alcohol industry strategy, that follows on from this normalisation of their involvement in policy making, was that their objective was to build long-term relationships with policy making. Now, when we talk about lobbying, or when we think about lobbying, very often we think of it being aggressive, issue-specific, short-term, designed to intervene in a particular policy debate or to stop a particular policy or to get a tax regime tweaked in a way that's favourable to a certain product category. But actually, what we found was most of the lobbying was about building up these long-term relationships, this slow build-up of contacts and goodwill and reciprocal obligations between actors in the industry and actors in government. And I remember we interviewed a former minister, a former public health minister in the UK, and she was saying that, when people, much as I sort of said earlier on, when people come to you and they're able to kind of deliver certain things for you, it's very hard to turn that down. But the consequence is that if you have organisations such as individual companies or trade associations involved in policy, kind of doing you a favour on policy delivery, when they pick up the phone about something else, it's very difficult to turn down that call. It's very difficult to engage with them in a kind of neutral or objective way. And I'm not a psychologist by training, but if any of you are psychologists and are interested in this, I think the role of kind of obligation and guilt and debt and reciprocity in engagements between policymakers and industry actors is a really interesting and fruitful avenue of research, I think. And okay, let's move over this as well. One of the things that was also noticeable in terms of the industry strategy on minimum pricing is that the policy came onto the agenda first in Scotland and then sort of seemed to move onto the agenda elsewhere in the UK and hasn't materialised at Westminster for whatever reason, was the way that the industry worked together to utilise a particularly Scottish framing of the policy or to use particularly iconic Scottish products such as whisky as a way of framing the policy debate as being about kind of jobs, culture and heritage in Scotland. And I think this is indicative of a broader strategy that the alcohol industry employs, that it tries to think globally. It has a global strategy about how it positions its products and markets its products, but it acts locally. So it will tailor this strategy to the particular local circumstances. So the industry acted via the Scotch Whisky Association. There were other trade associations that he could have acted via or could have formed the nucleus of its lobbying campaign on minimum pricing, but he used this particularly Scottish framing of the issues. Reading this paper that we published last year, or two papers actually that we published last year about the way in which the alcohol industry is now mirroring the tactics of the tobacco industry in terms of using legal challenges, either within the EU context or via investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms through bilateral trade agreements to challenge alcohol policies which it's unfavourable against. And one example of this would be minimum pricing in the UK, where there was a legal case that delayed the implementation of minimum pricing for around 5 years. So the Scottish Government passed legislation in 2012 to enact minimum pricing, and the final ruling in the case on minimum pricing by the UK Supreme Court was in November, so November just before Christmas. So around 5 years, the industry's legal challenges to this policy were able to delay its implementation. You can sell a hell of a lot of alcohol in 5 years, and a hell of a lot of other things happened. You think what happened in that period of time? Scotland could have voted to leave the United Kingdom, decided not to. The UK did vote to leave the European Union. Right, so a key strategy in sort of political lobbying is often just to delay stuff. If you can just stop stuff happening long enough, events intervene and take on their own course. Plus, again, what message does this send out to other governments considering minimum pricing? The chilling effect that we talked about earlier on in terms of the plain packaging case. I'm going to move over this quite quickly again because time's going on, but this is a paper that we wrote that looked at the evidence submissions by the alcohol industry to the Scottish Government's consultation on minimum pricing, and essentially they misrepresent the evidence. They promote weak evidence that favours their positions, and elide, miss out, or misrepresent strong evidence that supports policies that they're against. Surprise, surprise. So, differences with tobacco. The analysis here comes from a paper that we published in 2016 in Global Public Health called Reassessing Policy Paradigms, and we compare tobacco and alcohol industry, and we do that in a systematic way from a political economy perspective. And part of this paper was actually slightly controversial, right? Not least because this was actually undertaken within the context of a tobacco control research program and a tobacco control grant. One of the things that's been really powerful in tobacco control and moving forward the regulatory agenda on tobacco control has been this idea of tobacco exceptionalism. And this is the tobacco as a health issue and the tobacco industry as a kind of vector of disease are uniquely dangerous, right? And need to be treated in a kind of unique way. And this has been, and I've witnessed this myself in terms of kind of papers we've written and arguments we've put forwards, that it's very easy to make recourse to this idea of tobacco exceptionalism to support your argument. Well, of course we have to regulate this way on tobacco because it's a unique threat to public health. But actually the work that we did on alcohol led us to believe that this wasn't the case. This certainly wasn't the case in terms of the harms which result from alcohol. It certainly wasn't the case in terms of the strategies pursued by the alcohol industry. Yet we had this kind of policy regime that was so different, right? So at the EU level, you had this new Tobacco Products Directive in 2014, bringing in really extensive additional controls on tobacco. Many EU member states introducing plain packaging, Australia going for plain packaging, countries elsewhere in the world following suit. What happened in alcohol? The EU alcohol strategy expired in 2012, I think. And it's not been replaced. So there is no strategy. There is no EU alcohol strategy. So you've got this really strong use of single market law to enact measures on tobacco and no equivalent for alcohol. You've got the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control versus a much looser WHO global alcohol strategy. You've got Article 5.3 to exclude the tobacco industry, whereas you've got partnership-based approaches and co-regulation with the alcohol industry. And you've got market strategies and political strategies that are highly similar. So we took each of these kind of potential reasons for the different approach in turn, and we looked at them. So in terms of sort of product harms, these are sort of some figures for deaths, mortality globally. And you can see, I mean, the conclusion I would sort of take from this is that, tobacco, is more harmful than alcohol, certainly responsible for more deaths globally than alcohol, and a greater percentage of global mortality. There's also an important difference in terms of the product, and often the kind of discussion about alcohol versus cigarettes comes down to this, because there's no safe way to use cigarettes, right? And if you use cigarettes exactly as instructed by the producers, they will kill 50% of long-term users, right? So the way that you use cigarettes, you put it in your mouth, you light it, and you inhale the smoke. Now, alcohol can, and this is a source of kind of great debate amongst scholars and researchers, and certainly I'm not qualified to make a judgment on this, but it is possible to drink alcohol in moderation. Now, there may be disputes about what constitutes moderation and what constitutes a safe level, and some scholars would argue there is no safe level or no completely safe level of alcohol consumption. But alcohol producers would say that the harms that derive from alcohol are due to misuse, right? So people are not using the products as we recommend they be used. So people are opening a bottle of wine and drinking the whole thing, right? They're not opening a bottle of wine, having a small glass for their dinner, putting the cork back in and waiting until Tuesday or wait until the next day to have the rest of it. So there is a difference with the product, right? You can use alcohol as part of an overall healthy lifestyle. There is no safe way to smoke, and there is no level of smoking which is acceptably kind of risk-free. On the flip side of that, alcohol is responsible for an enormous range of different kind of socio-economic harms. Alcohol is associated, with things like increased rates of domestic violence in a way that cigarettes wouldn't be implicated with. Right? So the way in which we understand alcohol-related harm, the way in which we try and quantify it, and the kind of paths between alcohol use or alcohol misuse and harm are often more complex than the more straightforward kind of connections that are made with smoking. We looked at the different kind of elements of strategy as well, right? So if the products aren't different enough in terms of harm to justify this different approach, maybe there's something about the structures of the industry or the market strategies they pursue or the political strategies they pursue that would indicate this different approach. These are just some sort of figures here that indicate the level of concentration of ownership and the level of transnationality of the companies within each sector. And the takeaway message from this is that alcohol and tobacco are both highly concentrated industries. We use the beer sector as a proxy for alcohol because of the different product categories, it's much harder to draw overall conclusions. But the beer sector is the sector of the alcohol industry which is most like tobacco. The HHI scores are a recognition of the degree of concentration of ownership of the companies, and the higher the number, the more concentrated they are. So you can see that tobacco is a highly concentrated industry. The beer sector is less concentrated, but it's moving broadly in the direction of concentration through things like the recent merger between SAB Miller and AB InBev. All right? So the structure of the industries is highly similar. Now, in terms of the transnationality of the industries, okay, there's a transnationality index of companies that looks at the number of different markets that companies are active in. And again, the kind of takeaway is that if you look at the main international beer producers, the main international tobacco producers, tobacco is slightly more transnational, or is more transnational than alcohol, but alcohol and the beer sector are the most transnational sector after that. So again, there's high degrees of similarity in terms of the market structure. In terms of the market strategies they pursue as well, white stick cigarettes have been developed by the tobacco industry as a standard product, and sort of differentiated by brand. But the concentration of ownership allows them sort of a high degree of control over pricing. It allows them to segment markets. It allows them to have low price points to attract new smokers and to deter smokers from falling out at the bottom of the market. They use premiumisation, branding, to create kind of premium brands to drive value in certain sectors as well. and branding and advertising are the kind of key tools for that. There's also a shift from established markets to low and middle income markets as well. If we look at alcohol, now the key difference is that whereas the white stick cigarette has emerged as the kind of global product in the tobacco industry, we've got this much more diversified portfolio of different products within alcohol, so that would be a key difference. But again, branding, pricing and marketing are the key tools that the alcohol industry uses. Entry into low and middle income countries is a key strategic objective, and the sort of the concentration of ownership and the transnational nature of the companies enables the alcohol industry to pursue similar sort of market segmentation strategies, similar premiumisation strategies as the tobacco industry. So in terms of the way that they position their products and market their products and the way they seek to kind of recruit new consumers and extract value from those new and existing consumers is highly similar between the sectors as well. Their political strategy, again, you know, evidence that we've got from, you know, the much more limited literature on alcohol suggests that they do things in highly similar ways to the tobacco industry. The way that they seek to engage policymakers, to build relationships, to lobby aggressively on specific issues that emerge that their relationships can't keep off the policy agenda, the way they use legal challenges, and you know, the way that they provide governments with policy goods, the way they, you know, draft laws or undertake self-regulatory regimes is highly similar to the strategies that have been used by the tobacco industry. So, do we think then that the radically different approach that's been taken to tobacco control, the types of policies that are possible to do with tobacco, to introduce standardised packaging, to remove all the colour branding from a packet of cigarettes, that clearly wouldn't be possible or clearly would be much more politically controversial with the alcohol industry? Is that justifiable on the basis of the evidence we have about the structure and strategies of the industry? Is the fact that the alcohol industry is still able to attend, you know, the UN high-level meeting on NCDs in 2011 as a social partner, whilst the tobacco industry was overtly and explicitly excluded from that meeting? Alcohol brands are able to sponsor international sporting events. They sponsor Formula One, believe it or not. I mean, you know, despite the kind of messaging of the industry around drink driving, they sponsor Formula One. Tobacco industry doesn't. Tobacco industry is excluded from the Olympics. We've had smoke-free Olympics for the last 20 odd years, but alcohol brands are still central to the support of the Olympics. We have policymakers in this country happy to enter into voluntary and self-regulatory arrangements with the alcohol industry in a way that would be impossible for tobacco. So do the differences that exist between these industries justify this approach? My argument would be no, that we need a much more kind of robust regime and a much clearer policy discourse around the role of the alcohol industry as a vector of disease, as a driver of ill health. But this creates a problem. And again, I go back to the fact that we did that research as part of a tobacco control project. Because, you know, when you've got highly sophisticated political actors like alcohol industry corporations, like tobacco corporations, if you produce a piece of research that says actually tobacco exceptionalism is not justified, you can go one of two ways with that. You can either take that as a rationale for bringing up the standards of alcohol regulation, or you can see it as a rationale for undermining the exclusion of the tobacco industry from events like the UN high-level meeting. Well, if alcohol's just as bad as us, why are we out there while they're inside the room? So this is a very difficult issue, I think, for public health. And from an advocacy point of view in particular, it's one that needs to be handled and treated with great care. So I'm going to wrap up there, and I'm just going to leave that as an open question. We had to move through some of that quite quickly. So if any of you do want to look at the slides afterwards and you have other questions you want to follow up with after tonight, then please feel free to get in touch via email. Most of the papers that the research or the points come from are included in the slides. and I'm happy to stay and take any questions or listen to any comments that people have got now.
Good.
Thanks.